No matter how difficult life gets, there is always something to appreciate. I want to welcome everybody who is in person today. I'm so grateful for all of you who are joining us online this morning. In the movie The Last Samurai, Katsumoto is the leader of the samurai village, and they are dealing with the possible end of life as he knew it. The government and the culture were changing. They were becoming more Western in their dress and in the way that they went about conducting business and in the way that they waged war. For hundreds of years, the samurai were the ultimate warriors, and their counsel was sought out by many. They were very well respected by everyone around them, but that was all changing. In fact, they were becoming an obstacle to the forces of change. So Katsumoto was pondering a war he knew would probably cost him his life, and likely signal the end of the samurai way of life. And the weight of the world seemed to be heavy on his shoulders. Yet in the midst of all of this, he took time to stroll through a grove of cherry trees so he could enjoy their beauty. And he didn't just notice the beauty, he studied it. And he spent time enjoying the experience. And in the midst of all of the problems he was facing in life, he was taking time to quiet himself and to appreciate beauty. So I find myself every mid-December kind of doing the same thing, where I find myself reflecting back on a year, and some of that is because around this time I start writing an end-of-the-year email or letter to the church where I'm just recounting and thinking back through all the things God has done among us and through us from January through December. Jim Hinkle and I meet with all of the ministers for a self-review, an annual review, and a lot of that is reflecting back on what God has done. And Tyler and Annika, it's your favorite part of the year, right? Those annual reviews, you love doing them. But it's a time for us to do a lot of reflecting on what God has done. I spend time in my own life just reflecting back on the good and the bad. The funerals that we did, the sicknesses throughout the year, the good and the bad, and trying to find a way to appreciate God for it all. So right now we're in a study in Luke chapter 1, verses 16 through 17. You have a prophecy that's spoken over John the Baptist at his birth, and the prophecy is that God is going to use him to turn people. And what you see throughout the rest of the Gospel of Luke is that Jesus is the one who is often turning to people, and in response, people are turning to Jesus. So kind of what I placed in front of you over the last 2 weeks is, where does there need to be a turning in your life or a returning in your life to God and to the promises of God? So in Luke chapter 17, we have this story of a person who returns to Jesus. And this is a person whose life had fallen apart. And in the midst of his life falling apart, and because of his encounter with Jesus, of it being repaired, he finds himself returning to Christ. And I want to read the story for you. In Luke chapter 17, verse 11, it goes like this. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. And as he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him, keeping their distance. They called out, saying, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were made clean. And then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. And then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return to give praise to God except this foreigner?" And then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." Leprosy was and still is an awful disease. When I think of cruel diseases, I know there's so many of them, but when I think of a cruel disease, I think about Alzheimer's or dementia or diseases where there's memory loss. I think of ALS. I think of forms of cancer, and the list could go on. Leprosy was an awful disease. Leprosy is the breaking down of bodily cells in which you do not feel pain. And you may think it would be great not to feel pain, but there is a gift in pain. God has made our bodies to where it is a gift that we can feel some forms of pain. If you were hanging out in the yard with a friend and you stepped in an ant bed and you did not feel pain, you may be bit by hundreds of ants before you knew that there was pain. If you fall off a bike and scrape your knee, you may think it would be great not to feel pain, but if you don't feel pain, you don't know how serious a wound is. And if you don't know how serious a wound is, it can lead to all kinds of infections, both for the skin, but also even in the bloodstream. There's this gift of pain. So leprosy is the breaking down of bodily cells to where you don't feel pain. And what you have in the Old Testament are a couple of chapters that talk about leprosy and skin diseases. And what you find in Numbers chapter 5, verses 2 and 3 is, you command the Israelites to put out of the camp everyone who is leprous or has a discharge, or everyone who is unclean through contact with the corpse. You shall put out both male and female, putting them outside the camp. They must not defile their camp where I dwell among them. And in Leviticus chapter 13, verses 45 and 46, it says, the person who has leprous disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head be deceitful, excuse me. And he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall not live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So the all-knowing God had not yet allowed the human mind to advance to think about how the body works. So people thought that leprosy, if you had it, that it was so easy to transmit it, to spread it, which actually it wasn't. But as the breaking down of bodily cells, people couldn't feel pain. Their bodies are just deteriorating. It was so hard to watch and so hard to see. It led to isolation, where you were alone, away from a family, away from your spouse, away from kids, away from the community that you would always know. Theologically, it became a challenge because most people thought either you sinned or your parents sinned, that the wrath of God has come upon you with something like leprosy. People didn't want to catch the disease, and people also didn't want to catch everything that came with the disease, the loneliness and the fear and the pain. With leprosy, you couldn't touch other people, and they couldn't touch you. If you remember about 6 years ago, when COVID happened, there were a few weeks, maybe a few months, where we had to social distance, where you weren't supposed, or we were encouraged not to touch other people or hug other people or be hugged. I know for some people 6 feet became like 6 inches. They didn't follow any of the guidelines. For some people 6 feet was like 6 miles. It's like stay away from everybody. But you remember what it was like. Like, can we hug? Can we shake hands? Can we touch? Like, there were some things you could touch, some things you couldn't touch. With leprosy, you had to stay at least 50 feet away from others. So back when I was in elementary school, I considered the Dallas-Fort Worth area home. That's where I grew up. But I went to elementary school in a little town called Crockett, Texas, way in the piney woods of East Texas. A little town, about 6,000 or 7,000 people. It was my dad's first preaching job, and as we lived there, we went to everything. Any event, we were there. And whenever we went to high school events and basketball games in particular, my dad would often give us quarters to go get M&Ms, get Skittles, popcorn, Airheads, blow pops, whatever we wanted to do. So we would have these quarters, and we could do whatever we wanted with them. And one day we were sitting in the bleachers, and my brother was probably 6. I was probably 8. And a man came and he sat in front of us, and he was a rather large man, and I say this just to give you a visual. A rather large man sits in front of us, and he leaned forward, and as he leaned forward, I want to be careful how I describe this moment with you. As he leaned forward, there was space between his skin and his pants. All right? You couldn't see underwear. It was just skin and pants at an opening. And my brother was sitting behind this guy, and my brother was playing with his quarters, and one of my brother's quarters went in between this guy's skin and his pants. Now, I would think that right now, if somebody dropped a quarter down your pants, you would know it. You would move. You would be like, man, something just went into my pants. This guy didn't move at all. It was like you had just put a quarter in a vending machine, all right? It just... And my brother, who's 6 years old, did not hesitate. He was going in, all right? It was, and my brother's like going in, and my dad reached and just grabbed his hand and like gave him another quarter. Like somewhere that dude went home that night and he found a quarter in his pants, all right? He's probably telling this story today. There was this night I just found a quarter in my pants. Like, you know what it's like as parents, like with kids, like some things you touch, some things you don't touch. Like when it came to leprosy. Like you were removed from your spouse. You were not able to touch your children, to play with your children, to hug your kids. They couldn't hug you or touch you or give you a high five. You were removed from church, your work, your community. You were completely isolated. And then you have moments where Jesus comes on the scene. And one of a reputation that was given to Jesus is that Jesus healed people who were leprous, people who had leprosy. And you have these moments like in Luke chapter 5 or in Matthew chapter 8 when Jesus is approached by someone with leprosy and Jesus touched them before he healed them. And maybe there are those moments you skip over these details, but according to the law, according to the Old Testament, if you touch somebody who had leprosy or someone who had leprosy touched you, you became unclean. You couldn't be in their presence and they couldn't be in your presence. And there are multiple times that Jesus touched someone by the law. It was a moment that made him unclean. But for Jesus, it was wanting to heal people of a social disease before he healed them of a physical disease. It was Jesus knowing this is someone who's been isolated for community. So first what I want to do before I heal them is I want them to know that the power of God is coming in their life to restore them to society and community, and that the kingdom of God is coming to heal them. So I've shared this story before, but when I preached in Houston, where I preached before here, I was reading Luke chapter 5 and Matthew 8. I was preaching this sermon on Jesus healing this person with leprosy and touching the person before he healed the person. And I remember sitting in my office that day as I was studying, and I was overcome with gratitude for a God, for Jesus, who is willing to touch the untouchable and love the unlovable. So there was this moment of gratitude just in my own life of how Jesus does this for me. And then I found myself praying, okay, Jesus, if I see you living in a way that you were willing to touch the untouchable and love the unlovable, what does this look like in my own life? Like, how can I follow you in a way where I am willing to touch the untouchable and love the unlovable in my own life? I'm preaching this sermon, praying those prayers in my office, and the doorbell rang at church. And it was a woman named Narcine. Narcine was for this church, it was our Lee Brown at the church in Houston, Texas. Narcine lived on the streets of Houston. She would often have a motel to live in, maybe a hotel. People would put her up in apartments for days, maybe a few weeks. But her mail came to our church. So she would often come to get letters or bills or cards. And this day, Narcine comes to the church, rings the doorbell, and Narcine said, I'm hungry. Do you have anything for me to eat? And we didn't have anything at the church, but I said, Narcine, let's go across the street to the convenience store, and I'll get you a few things. Now, Narcine, mentally, she had some challenges. And Narcine would wear a pair of sweatpants and a sweatshirt for weeks at a time in Houston, Texas, in the summertime, over 100 degrees for days. And she would wear the same pair of sweatpants and sweatshirt for weeks without ever washing them. And I'm not being funny in saying this, but if I would ever drive Narcine places, like if I took her to Taco Bell or I took her to a place for the rest for the night, my truck would smell like Narcine for days. So I went inside the convenience store, and I'm just getting her a bag full of peanut butter crackers and bottled waters and things. And as I'm doing this, I sensed the Lord say, do you remember how you've been praying over the last few hours for me to teach you how to love the unlovable or touch the untouchable? And I sensed the Lord say, when you go give this to Narcine outside, I want you to hug her, and I want you to put your hand on her shoulder, and I want you to give her a blessing in my name. And I remember having this moment of bargaining with God of, can I just give Narcine a fist bump? Is that okay? He's like, no, if you want to follow Jesus, this is what I want you to do today. And I went and I put my hand on her shoulder, and I gave her a blessing, and we prayed, and I hugged her. And as I did, Narcine said, Josh, you know that no one has hugged me in weeks. There's something about following Jesus in a way of, what does it mean to be like Jesus? That we're willing to touch the untouchable and love the unlovable. For Jesus, he was into healing people of diseases. But he also wanted to instill and to give dignity, especially in places where dignity had been taken away from people. And in the case of those with leprosy, it's exactly what had happened. And the only way to receive dignity again was to be seen by the priest. So the Old Testament gives 2 chapters to helping priests diagnose diseases. And I am so glad I do not have this responsibility today. That if you were to come visit me, I would love to talk to you about your prayer life, about the Bible, about suffering, about pain, about relationships. I do not want any of you calling me to say, I need to come visit you because I have this rash and I need you to tell me if I'm clean or unclean. Like, I don't want that responsibility or that job. There are 2 chapters given in the Old Testament to priests to help them diagnose diseases, to tell people whether they are clean or unclean, which meant the priest had the task and the responsibility to tell people you were unclean. And not only are you unclean, you need to go tell your spouse and you need to go tell your kids that you're not going to see them maybe for weeks or maybe for the rest of your life. This could not have been a fun job for them. So here's how the story goes, and let me just point out a few things. In verse 11, it says Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. This is in chapter 17. In chapter 9, verse 51, you see that Jesus has turned his face to Jerusalem. So from Luke 9:51 through the rest of Luke, all the way to the cross, Jesus is making his way to Jerusalem to die. Yet in almost every chapter, you have these moments when Jesus is stopped by people, and when he is, he gives them his undivided attention. Take a lesson from Jesus. That life is not just about getting from point A to point B. It's your willingness to see how God is working in that in-between space. And when you sense the presence of God at work, that you give God and you give the person your undivided attention who is in front of you. It's what Jesus did. He's often distracted. He gives people his undivided attention, and he ends up healing people like this person with leprosy. In verse 12, what you have are 10 people with leprosy who come to Jesus, but they keep their distance. So like they know their role. So there are 10 of them, which meant there was this isolated community, so at least they had each other, and they come to Jesus, but they keep their distance. They know what the law says. They can't come very close. What you have in the next verse is that they start crying out to Jesus. This is the only time in the Gospel of Luke that you have someone who is not an apostle or a close disciple of Jesus calling Jesus master. So you have them who are crying out. Apparently they know who Jesus is, they know he's a master, and they're crying out for mercy. Maybe they're crying out for mercy because they know Jesus has the power to heal them. Maybe they're crying out for mercy because of their own misery. Whatever it is, they're crying out to Jesus for mercy. What you see in the next verse is, in verse 14, it says when Jesus saw them. It doesn't say when Jesus heard them. So it wasn't just that Jesus heard them crying out for mercy and decided to respond to their cry. It's not that he heard them, he saw them. When he saw how their bodies were deteriorating and just breaking down, he saw them. And what Jesus says is, go and show yourself to the priest. Jesus doesn't heal them on the spot. He doesn't touch them to heal them. He doesn't do those funny things sometimes Jesus does. He doesn't spit on the ground and make mud, put it on their bodies, or ask them to go wash in a water somewhere down the road. He doesn't heal them in the moment. He says, go show yourself to the priest. And I don't know for them if this was hopeful or if this was like PTSD, because most of them, the last time they had seen the priest, they had been told, you have to go in isolation. And maybe there had been moments they had gone back to the priest, and the priest checked them out and said, you still can't leave isolation. Jesus says, I need you to go to the priest. If you look in verse 15, or at the end of verse 14, what it says is, on their way, they experienced the healing power of God. And I don't know if this was instantaneous. I don't know if all 10 were healed right there, like at the same moment, or if it was like one by one, or like one arm gets better and then the next. I don't know, but they just experienced the healing power of God. And then one of them decides to go back to Jesus. I do not blame the 9 for doing what they did. In fact, the 9 who didn't return to Jesus actually obeyed what Jesus told them to do. You go to the priest, and if the priest says you're clean, you get to be reunited with your spouse and your kids and your community and your work. There's one who decided to hit pause on the cleansing, on the priest telling him he's clean, to go back to Jesus. He goes back to Jesus and falls at his feet, and he worships Jesus as his healer. And then Jesus had a couple of questions for him. Like, where are the others? Are they not here? And your faith has made you well. Let me say just a few things about this story. Sometimes healing can be found in obedience. And I want to be careful how I talk about healing, because I hope and I believe and I pray for miraculous healing for some of you who are in this worship experience right now. But I never want to preach or proclaim the gospel in a way that makes it sound like if you just have faith or you get so many people praying that God's going to heal you exactly how you're asking to be healed. But sometimes healing can be found in obedience. Healing doesn't always come to you. Sometimes you have to go toward healing. So in this moment, Jesus doesn't heal him on the spot. He sends him on the move. So there's a word for us in this, that don't stay passive. It's too easy to become a victim in our pain or to think that things will never change. And sometimes to be healed, you have to move to it. You can't just wait for it to come to you. So in that moment, it was go to a priest. For you today, it may be go to a prayer partner or go to a friend or go to a minister or go to a shepherd or go to a therapist. But move toward where you want healing to come in your life. And I am not promising that healing will come as you move with God or toward God or because God told you to move. But I do believe that when we move with obedience, forms of healing will find us. The gift of returning becomes what we have. The gift of returning is something we do because we have been touched by God. There were 9 who were healed, and they were in a hurry to be reunited. You would be too. And 1 returned to give praise to his healer. There are times when we need to be reminded that if we want to move forward in life, we need to maybe push pause on moving forward to thank God for the work he has done in our past. Returning reminds us of healing. It reminds us of the faithfulness of God. It reminds us of the goodness of God. And reflection often leads to praise. Reflection reveals God's presence, especially in the hard, difficult times. So maybe this holiday season, return to a place where you're praising and appreciating God for what he has done in your life this year. And the only reason that those lepers would go to a priest was to receive a diagnosis. And Luke doesn't tell us about a family reunion. We don't get the moment spouses were reunited and children hugged their fathers and mothers for the first time. We get the story of one person who was healed, and instead of going to the priest so he could go to his family, he returned to the presence of Jesus, to the one who healed him so that he could say, thank you. Sometimes when your life has changed, praise is the only response you have. And this man behaved like a person in love, not just a person who had been healed. Many would choose to chase after the other 9. It seems to be the safer route. They followed the rules, they knew the path, they checked the boxes. But sometimes love doesn't play it safe. It takes a risk, and it turns, and it returns. And for this man, he entered into the presence of Jesus twice. Once to cry out for mercy, and another to praise God because he had received it. Don't ever get weary of entering into the presence of Jesus to cry for mercy. And when you know that you have received it, don't ever grow weary in entering into the presence of Jesus to thank God for it. So it's really this simple when it comes to experiencing more joy in your life. It is to learn to appreciate, to express gratitude, to see God in the hard times, to choose God in the hard times, and to sometimes hit pause in your life to offer up a word of praise to God for his work in your life. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 25. And we don't get a lot of moments when Paul quotes Jesus, but this is a moment that Paul quotes Jesus. And it's the last Passover. Within hours before Jesus dies, Jesus took the bread, he took the cup, and it says he gave thanks. That's what many people call communion today, the Eucharist. It means we give thanks. And to think how Jesus held the bread and held the cup in his hands and offered up thanks to God, knowing he was within hours of him laying down his life and dying an awful death. Yet he gave thanks. Because even in the suffering, Jesus had a feel for salvation and restoration and redemption. So no matter where you are in your life today, you are invited to the table in this moment to receive the cup, receive the bread, and to give thanks for God's work and salvation and your part in this story. We have prayer partners who are around this room. Todd, one of our shepherds. Tommy, one of our shepherds. I think Lee Vernice and Laura will be receiving whoever it is who may need prayer this morning. Step towards your healing. Step and give God thanks for the mercy that he pours out on your life. Let's close our eyes and bow our heads. And God, I often find myself waking up in the morning and thanking you that there is not a day that we wake up that you forget to dispense mercy. So thank you how your mercy greets us each day. Thank you for how your mercy greets us at this table. And as we receive the bread and the cup today, which reminds us, Jesus, of everything you have done to buy us back, to redeem our lives, our response to you today is to give thanks. And we give thanks in the name of Jesus. And the church said, amen.